Hello, this is episode 85 of Stand Up, where every day I'll talk to expert people, real people, and you people. I'm Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up. Hey guys, thank you very much for joining me today. I've got an excellent show planned for you. I have three awesome guests, including historian Kenneth Davis, talking about why we desperately need leadership and how to feed America. And now guess who did that? Herbert Hoover? Yeah, that's right. Also, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is an anti-racist professor and a best-selling author and really great writer. Awesome work in The Atlantic, where he's a contributor. His recent piece is about the racial disparities with COVID-19, and it's very, very important. Had a wonderful conversation with him. But before those two, we're going to kick it off with, guess who? My wife. She's back. A lot of listeners are saying, we haven't heard from Val. Many of you have been taking her classes online, or yoga classes, fitness classes, but she's always great in this conversation. And so she's going to join me to talk about my anxiety with my work-life balance that I'm struggling with. But I first wanted to read just a couple of messages. This podcast is funded and completely sustained not by advertisements, but by individuals like you. Completely independent media, and you can subscribe for as little as $5 on patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And something really interesting has been happening lately. I'm well over 500 subscribers now with this podcast, but really, I use the word really way too often. A lot of people signing up, and I don't know why. It probably has something to do with the fact that I'm doing it daily now. I don't know, but the shows have been great. Awesome guests lately, and I wanted to just read a couple of the subscribers' messages to me. Mario wrote to me and said, I finally decided to support you on a monthly basis. I wish it could be more, but I nevertheless wanted to contribute to your success in some way. I've been listening to you since I heard you on the Joe Rogan show, and I was struck by your sincerity, vulnerability, forthrightness, and all-around good guy demeanor. I see the same thing in your dad and your brother. Your show has become daily medicine for me, and I hope you continue on your path to building your empire of goodness. All the best, Mario. Mario, holy cow, empire of goodness. I think I might just have a new name for this show. Wow, that was a flattering email and gave me a lot of purpose and inspiration, and I can't. I don't know what to tell you, man. I'm psyched that you heard me on Rogan, and I'm really happy that you came over here and you're now paying for a subscription. Benny wrote to me and said, another great episode about yesterday's episode with the great Bruce Bartlett. I also love the second conversation as well, and that was with listener and patron Karen Madison. That's from yesterday. He said, it got me thinking about how being myself has affected my mood, and I must say I'm getting a little depressed, and it's manifesting in me being very curt with people. I'm trying to catch myself and back up, but there's no way to decompress and nothing to look forward to, so I'm just trying to relax and be calm more. There's a long way to go still. Benny, way to be self-reflective and self-aware and know what's going on. That's a huge part of the battle, right? I mean, it's a lot harder to solve these problems, but to know that you're having them and recognizing them and being mindful, good for you, pal. And Mark B. writes, hey, Pete, terrible show you've got there, a thing we used to say. It's a thing for insiders, terrible show. It's actually a compliment. He says, seriously, I'm really enjoying the new podcast. I missed you terribly when you left SiriusXM, and I'm so glad I found you again. You really helped me deal with all the shit going on around us. Thanks for all of the effort, man. It's appreciated more than you know. Stay safe and stay healthy. Mark, thank you. And finally, another Mark. This time is Mark D. He says, Pete, thank you. Mind-blowing conversations. I've listened to episode 80 with Tom Shadyac twice. It's so emotional, it brings me to tears. And your ability to engage with these people so thoughtfully and articulately and convey these messages to your audience is your superpower. I had to read those 4 messages because they made me feel so good, and I want you, all of you, to know these are the type of people that are listening and contributing to this show. I'm letting you tell your stories on this show. It's starting to feel like the old magic, and we are capturing it together. Your input is so helpful. Your appearance on the show and you telling your stories during this crazy, unprecedented, uncertain times is really helping people. So thank you. I got a whole lot of new friends, and guess what? So do you. That's right. This is a community. We're going to keep talking to each other, communicating with each other, telling each other stories, talking about the struggles. These are unprecedented times, and unprecedented times call for unprecedented conversations in this case, media in this case, and connecting with other people who are dealing with what you're dealing with and helping each other. And you know who does that better than anybody for me? My wife. Let's do this. I have a lot of guilt.
We're just diving right into it.
Yes.
Okay. No small talk?
You want to make small talk?
No, I'm just weird.
We're husband and wife. Do we make small talk?
Well, I don't know.
Do couples make small talk?
Just going right into it. It just seems weird. But go ahead.
Well, do you want to talk about how a lot of professional sports are just...
No, don't want to talk about sports.
I feel a real sense of guilt when I'm not working actively on work-related, career-related, money-producing things. If I'm not in my studio, if I'm not in front of my computer, if I'm not creating content, doing all the things that I have to do, I have a sense of guilt, and I hate it because I know it's wrong. And it's not always, but it's often. And I want the work-life balance that I used to have. I want that again. And I'm having a really hard time not having that. I feel like I have a huge list of things that I can never get through. I'm always behind, and that I'm doing something wrong by relaxing. And by that, I mean going for a walk, exercising, and being in the garden mainly, as well as doing all my household chores from mowing the lawn. Like if I'm doing any of those things, I feel like I shouldn't be.
You feel like you should be doing work-related things.
Yeah. Always have to be working constantly all day, as long as I'm awake, get to work, go to work, do the work. And I like my work. I do, but it's overwhelming and there's no balance. And I feel a lot of guilt if I'm not doing it.
So what it seems like you're saying is that you do those other things, but when you're doing them, you're not fully enjoying them because there's this sense of guilt that you should be doing something else.
That is often the case. I'm not fully enjoying them, and while I'm not doing them enough. I do them, but I'm not doing them enough. And I just feel like this conversation is a good one to have in the podcast because I'm sure I'm not alone. Mm-hmm. So many people working from home, mm-hmm. and working from home is way different for a lot of us.
Well, I can tell you that this is an issue that I'm an expert at, because I've been dealing with this my entire life, not just in quarantine and not just when I'm extremely busy. So this is something new to you perhaps, but I've been dealing with it always and forever. And I come to find out there's a term for it. It's called time scarcity.
Oh.
Yeah, time scarcity. Which was really, when I heard that, I was like, oh, scarcity. There's that word again, because I'm very, very intimate with that word scarcity. My whole life, scarcity.
Why?
Oh well, it's tagged along with not enough, and usually it's a scarcity mindset is relates to finances. So, but I had it with everything, not smart enough, not loved enough, not just not good enough at anything I did. But mainly, I think it's easy to just point it to the financial, I feel the same way I felt when I was 20 and I was making a third of what I'm making now. So it's this idea that no matter how much money you have, you never have enough and never feels secure enough. And the time scarcity is something that I've always felt. So it's this idea that there's just never enough time to do what you want to do. And then because of that, when you are doing what you want to do, you feel like you should be doing something else.
Yes.
Because that something else is more productive.
But how do we... Right.
Right. So there's always this level of angst that you feel, because there's this certain level of guilt that you have to negotiate for doing anything. And there's never enough time to do what you want to do. And then if you make the time to do what you want to do, then you're like, oh God, I should be doing this. And then you're in your mind, you're like, okay, I have this, and that, another thing to do. And if I do that first before I do this, then maybe I could enjoy what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
But the problem is when you get down through the list, you don't have time to do the thing that you're enjoying.
Exactly. So well said. Yes, you are an expert on this. So what do you do?
Yeah.
What's the answer, babe?
Well, fortunately, I don't have the answer. But
That's not fortunate. That's unfortunate.
That's what I mean. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. I'm really good at the problem, though. But I think I have worked it through enough that I have little solutions that I have not put into practice enough, because I still battle this demon every day of my life. But there's also, I think there's the phone has exacerbated this problem for me.
Yeah, why?
And exacerbated this problem for the world, because there's this other term I heard, which is also very enlightening, called time confetti. If you just kind of dissect that and think about that, time confetti.
Our time is all fragmented?
Yes, our time is all completely fragmented. So when we have those periods of pause, we want to fill it with something productive. Like you're in the grocery line, you're like, oh, I have 5 minutes to answer an email so that I don't have to answer it later. So all the moments that you do pause, you think that you are making up that time in that moment, but what you're doing is sabotaging that time.
Yeah, well, what should you be doing if not returning that email or going through your to-do list with that 5 minutes? You're supposed to just be mindful and notice your surroundings.
So I think the idea is being in that moment and trying to find meaning in that moment without having to fill it with something more purposeful. So find the purpose in just being present, right? So that's the idea, and know that email is going to be there, and you'll probably be able to answer it better when you have time to sit and focus, and when your time isn't interrupted and fragmented.
You know who I hate, by the way, on a tangent, is the people who set aside a certain time of their day to return emails. They're that organized that they have, this is when I return emails. I'm like, fuck you. Really? Do you really have that time set aside? Or are you like the rest of us and you're scatterbrained, returning emails whenever you get to them and forgetting half of them?
Well, I think there's part of you that envies that person.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that person has it together.
Yeah.
So I think we all aspire to be a little bit of that person. But
the most organized, efficient person who has a really good handle on her workflow.
Well, I think that the phone makes us think that we're making more use out of our time and consolidating our time, when in actuality we're fragmenting it. So you're basically working all day long, or your mind is at work all day long. When it's like it goes against the intuition, right? The intuition is like, okay, I'm gonna answer this text now, I'm gonna answer this email right now, so I don't have to do it later. But what it's doing is it's robbing you from that moment, and you're gonna be, trust me, you'll be filling that time later with something else, work related or obligation related. So I think that's part of it, is where we have that time confetti with the phones now. I think one of the solutions is putting that phone down and, giving yourself permission to have this hour or these 2 hours or these 30 minutes or these 15 minutes to do what you have to do without that interruption.
The reason why this came up so acutely this morning is because I was taking your yoga class that you're teaching virtually, and everybody should join us. And
that was fun.
And it wasn't fun for me because for the
so
second time in a row, I love doing the yoga class, and I was riddled with guilt because the whole class I was thinking about all the things I had to do.
Yeah, and it ruined your experience.
Yeah, it keeps
because you still have the experience, but now you made it negative.
Right. Well, it didn't ruin the experience. It made me realize that
you weren't able to fully experience that.
But it seemed like the most like cliche or quintessential thing where you should be in the moment, listening to your body and whatever. And I'm in there making
Doing
a list.
the opposite of what I'm telling you to do.
Well,
It's
yeah,
typical.
yes, yeah, not paying attention at times because I've got things on my mind, and it's like if I'm not doing it in yoga or when I'm in the garden or other places, when do I give my permission? How do I get better at that? I felt bad that I couldn't stay more focused in the moment. I was thinking more about all the things I had to do today, and the same thing happened last week. That's why the first session was, in a way, the best session because I didn't do that. It's really in the moment.
Well, you had some awareness that you did do that, and I think then you layered on that second arrow, the Buddhists call, is the second layer of guilt of feeling bad that you did do that.
Right.
Instead of finding, the compassion and honoring the wisdom that you had and noticing that.
You said earlier also, though, when I was telling you about this, it won't be that way forever. It's going to get, you're going to figure things out. And
you're not cursed like I am. You were able to not do that before. This is a new thing for you. I think that you are feeling that financial pressure, and that's why. It's not like it's an ingrained part of your psyche like a lot of people.
And the final complaint is a very personal one, and I don't know if it's appropriate for the podcast, but I'm going to say it because I think there's probably a lot of people who feel this way, which is when I worked at a corporate job and I put in my time and I went into work and I did my stuff and I came home and I had balance and I got a paycheck and we had what we had financially, I felt like that would relieve you.
Like you're punching out?
No, it would help you not have to worry about more, that you had to do more work, that you had more on your mind, more concern about money, more concern about making money yourself. Like, I felt like I was relieving that burden for you, and now I feel like because I'm not making that kind of money and you're working a lot more, that it's become harder for you, and I feel guilt there.
Like, in what way harder for me?
You have to work a lot more to make up for it, A, and B, even if you didn't, and that was certainly what you wanted to do, you just would have more concern and worry about money, and that would pile up, and it wasn't that way.
Okay. I mean, yeah.
That's true. It makes it harder for you.
Well, it's just the financial insecurity, of course, is hard. Is that what you're asking? That makes it harder for me, but the time scarcity thing is the same. That's not different. Because
you always felt like not everything that you had to do, so much of your responsibilities weren't necessarily about earning money. I mean, you're always going, always going,
right.
doing
I have
stuff.
to work more, and that's fine. But I realize now that I'm working more that I have less time.
Right.
That it's no different. I still am in the same mindset. I still felt, even though my day is so much busier than it was just even 2 years ago, those 2 years ago, I still felt like I had no time for anything.
Right.
So it really is irrelevant how much actual time you have. It's all in your head. It really is, because there's that saying too, is the busier you are, the more you get done. I mean, there is that. I mean, time is just it's just like an illusion.
That's a good place to end. Thank you.
We ending?
Yeah.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. It's great advice. Time scarcity, time confetti. Time is an illusion. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
You're welcome.
How about that? She did it again. That's my wife. That's my life partner. That's my life guru. You can be friends with her on Facebook, Valerie Vendrame. She doesn't really tweet, but she's at VV Yoga. And you can hire her if you want. She can be your health coach, your life coach, your personal trainer mostly, and yoga teacher is mostly what she's doing. Virtual sessions, Zoom sessions. So if you want to do that, we'd love to have you join us. Okay, next. The big show guest today, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. This guy is awesome. He is so brilliant, and to call yourself an anti-racist or not racist, you're not allowed unless you read his work. I mean, that's preposterous. But I'm telling you, I've gotten so enlightened by reading his stuff. And I've been on a real journey for a long time to try to understand the history of racism and the effects of racism in this country. And this guy writes about it, researches it, and teaches it. And, well, here he is. Joining me now is the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, where he's also a professor of history and international relations, and he's also a columnist at The Atlantic. He's a contributor to CBS News, and he is an amazing author, best-selling author. He won the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction for his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and his most recent book is excellent. It's a must-read. You must buy it. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, thank you so much for joining me, and great work in your recent reporting on the virus and the racial disparities in the Atlantic magazine. Everybody has to read it. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, of course, for having me on the show.
Yeah, you've written 3 articles here, and the first 2 articles were a lot of speculation based on history of public health and racism in America, that there was going to be a racial pandemic within the viral pandemic. But your most recent article has all of the data that we need. But before we get to it, why were you speculating?
Well, I was speculating because we didn't have the data. Initially, most states were not releasing the racial demographics of the people who were being tested, who were being infected with the coronavirus, who were being hospitalized, and who were being killed. And the federal government was not urging them to do so. So we didn't have really any data to even see whether, in fact, a particular racial group was being disproportionately infected or even killed. And so we called for it, and we've been calling for it for weeks. And now over 30 states have released some form of racial data on COVID patients.
And by we, you're referring to the Atlantic's magazine's COVID tracking project and your colleagues at the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University?
Yes, and then also, I mean, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Senator Elizabeth Warren also called weeks ago for racial data. Other members of Congress have partnered with them. We've had public health officials. We've had editorial boards. We've had local activists. I mean, it's really been a chorus over the last few weeks.
And now the data is in, and let's discuss it, because you have the data here in this article. You write, at this point in the pandemic, the disparities between the size of the black population and the percentage of black people infected with, hospitalized with, or dead from COVID-19 appear to be the most severe. You go on and cite the Washington Post analysis, the Associated Press analysis. You talk specifically about the percentage of black folks in New Orleans and New York City who are comprising a lot more of the victims than they represent in terms of the population. So we've got the data here, but the question is why, and you answer it in this article so poignantly and articulately. It's titled, Black People Are Not to Blame for Dying of the Coronavirus. Why would we think otherwise? I think a little history lesson is in store.
Well, I think first and foremost, I wanted to point out in this essay that for many Americans, they believe that Black people are getting infected and dying at higher rates because Black people are not taking the coronavirus seriously, because Black people are not social distancing, because Black people are to blame. And studies have shown, and I cite those studies in this piece, that indeed Black people, according to surveys, are actually more likely than, let's say, white people to take the coronavirus seriously, but they're still dying at higher rates, and so why? That why is racism, and I think it's an extremely sort of complex set of reasons why. But I mean, you take something as simple, for instance, as studies have shown that Black and even Latino Americans are more likely to work in jobs right now that they cannot work from home.
Right.
And so what happens then is they have to, in order to make a living, go out to work. And therefore, by their very economic nature, they're not able to completely social distance. And then they're more likely thereby to get infected. And if what's happening in the United States is similar to what's happening, for instance, in China, the overwhelming majority of coronavirus sort of spread happened within families, in which a person who was infected would come into their home and infect the rest of the family. And so that could presumably be happening. Then combined with the fact that Black people are more likely to have some of the pre-existing conditions like heart disease and asthma and others that make you more likely to not be able to survive the coronavirus, which stems from being forced to live in food deserts, which stems from being forced to live in trauma deserts, which stems from receiving inferior care. And, we can go all down the line, which stems from being more likely to live in environmentally hazardous communities. And that's how Black people could be dying at a higher rate, for instance, than white people.
You mentioned it here, but I want to just go back to the very first point you made. There is data that says, and there's polling that says Black people are much more concerned and taking the virus much more seriously. But the message that the public gets from media, from politicians, and from our own biases is that they aren't taking it more seriously. They've heard about this conspiracy that some Black folks had, that they were immune to the virus. But what you're saying, and you spell this out so eloquently as always, just because some individual Black people believe that doesn't mean the majority believe it. And as I said, the majority took it more seriously than white folks and everybody else, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the difficulties of being Black in America. It's that you're not really allowed to be an individual. And so when a person sees another Black person who is refusing to social distance, who is not taking the coronavirus seriously, who is believing this sort of myth that circulated early in this pandemic that Black people were immune, people don't just see an individual who is not taking the coronavirus serious. They see Black people not taking the coronavirus seriously. And then they turn around and look at these disparities in which Black people are more likely to be infected or die of coronavirus. And they're like, oh, that's because they're not taking it seriously. But, as you stated, I actually showed some of the early data. For instance, the Pew Research Center did a national survey between March 10th and March 16th. That was long before we had racial data showing that Black people were disproportionately being harmed by this virus. And according to that national survey, about 46% of Black people were taking this coronavirus very seriously, which was 25 percentage points higher than the number of white people at 21% who were taking this coronavirus seriously and saw it as a threat to their health. Another study that was conducted days later also found that Black people were more likely to be concerned about their health during this pandemic. So this idea that Black people are getting infected because they're not responsibly taking the coronavirus seriously is just a flat out not true.
I think that's one of the most important parts of this article, but everybody should read the entire thing because all of it is super important. But you just said it, but I want to read from this part in the article where you write it. You say, when it comes to Black people, whenever Americans see a Black individual acting in a self-destructive manner, they see Black people actively in a self-destructive manner. Whenever Americans see a Black individual not social distancing, they see Black people not social distancing. Whenever Americans see a group of Black individuals congregating at a party or a funeral, they see Black America congregating at a party or a funeral. And here is the most important line. Black individuals are always stand-ins for their race, never individuals. And then you cite Barack Obama from Dreams of Our Father, where he writes, only white culture had individuals. I don't know if you can add anything to that. I just really wanted to read it because to see you write it that way is exactly how I feel and have seen, I think, black people a lot myself with my own bias throughout my life.
So I think, what I would add to is actually what I tried to explain further down. There's nothing wrong with sort of begging all Americans to take this vicious virus seriously. There's nothing wrong with, if you're a black person or a non-black person and you see a black individual who is not taking the coronavirus seriously, to beg them to do so. Just as if you're white and you have a white daughter who's not taking it seriously, or a Latina sister, or an Asian father, or a Native friend. It's important for us to get all individuals to take this seriously. But it's a very different thing to lecture a racial group to behave better as a solution to racial disparities. That in and of itself is saying the reason why black people are more likely to be infected and die of coronavirus is because there's something they are not doing. There's something wrong with them, as opposed to the society they're forced to live in, as opposed to racism being the problem. We're not only victimizing them through racism, then we're stomping on their heads and saying they are the reason why they're dying. And so this is like a double entendre. In other words, black people are dying, and then we're blaming black people for dying.
Right.
And so I just wanted to point that out.
And you did so well. And you asked the question, if black people receive inferior care from hospitals and doctors, are black people to blame? If black people are less likely to be insured, are black people to blame? If hospitals in majority black counties are overloaded with coronavirus patients, are black people to blame? And you go on to answer this, and it's you write, according to this logic, racism is not murderous. Black people are killing themselves. To be black in America is to be suicidal, and that is a real powerful thought experiment. It's, I guess, not an experiment. It's an actual literal way that we think, isn't it?
It is. I mean, if we, for instance, compare this to another debate we've been having in this country really for 5 years, and that's the debate over police shootings. You pretty much have two different perspectives. You have those Americans who are saying that black people are disproportionately dying at the hands of police violence because there's something wrong with them, because they asked for it for the police, because they were aggressive towards the police officer, because they stupidly challenged or disrespected or were, behaved badly with the police officer. In other words, they're the cause of their own death. And then you have other Americans who are saying, no, the reason why black people are disproportionately dying as a result of police violence is because of the racist policies within our policing system. It's because black police officers know they're more likely to, basically police officers are allowed to use lethal force if they perceive a threat to be there. And we also know that to be black is to be perceived as a threat. And so legally, racist ideas become essentially, they become loaded, and they're able to consistently shoot down black people. And so, I'm trying to sort of make the case that black people are not suicidal, just like white people are not generally suicidal, and Asian and Latinx people and Native people. And if a group of people are dying of anything at disproportionate rates, it's not because there's something wrong with them. It's because there's something wrong with us in our society.
You say that this is the same, basically, as all of the other issues. If we don't come to terms with America's original sin, and you say this is a theme throughout your work and many others as well, how do we look at the origins of black folks being brought here and where we're at now, and why do we need to be reminded by that and all of these and so much of your work and your writing?
Well, I think because fundamentally in the last 2 weeks, Americans have learned that we have these racial disparities as far as infection and death rates. For instance, in New York State, black people make up about less than 10% of the population, but they're dying double their population share. The same doubling of their population share is occurring in Louisiana and Illinois. And so we know this is the case. So then the next question becomes why? And it's the same sort of question that Americans have been arguing over from the beginning of this republic. Why do racial disparities exist? And Americans have been giving the same answer from the beginning of this republic. Some Americans have been blaming Black people, and other Americans have been blaming racism. And those Americans who blame Black people typically refuse to acknowledge the existence of racism itself. Mm-hmm. They refuse to acknowledge it in 1787, just as they refuse to even use racial language in the U.S. Constitution, just as Americans refuse to acknowledge that today. And, if there's anything we as Americans need to acknowledge and confess, it is this original sin of racism.
Could I have you read the final paragraph of this piece from The Atlantic? The article is titled, "Black People Are Not to Blame for Dying of the Coronavirus." Read everything that Dr. Kendi writes, especially these last 3 articles that he's contributed to The Atlantic. But you talk about at the beginning of this article how you and just a few others were crying out about this issue into the wilderness, desperately in need for racial data on the pandemic. Would you mind reading this last part that starts with, "I want to imagine the day"?
Sure. I want to imagine the day when the wilderness finally clears for good, when our anti-racist voices are heard for good, when Americans will no longer blame Black people for Black death. I want to imagine the day when every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground will become smooth and the rugged land a plain. But I cannot see that day right now because I remain in the wilderness.
Thank you for joining me, and I just want you to know that I am always hearing you. Every cry, every shout, every word that you're writing. I wish I had the biggest audience in the world to share it with, but I do know that the folks who listen, follow, which is getting bigger, care a lot about what you're writing and what you're saying. It's made a huge impact on my life, and I'm constantly trying to share it with folks. Thank you so much for joining me again.
You're welcome. Thank you much, Pete, for your work. And yeah, I mean, we're trying.
You're doing great work. As frustrating as I'm sure it must be quite often. It's so valuable. Thank you for what you're doing.
You're welcome. You take care.
That is Ibram X. Kendi. He is a PhD and a professor at American University, and you just have to read his stuff. So powerful, so important, so valuable, and I'm so flattered and honored that he joined me on today's show again. Please go buy his books, follow him on Twitter, support him, let him know you heard him here so that he'll keep joining me and having conversations like that one. All right, final guest of the program is my favorite historian, Professor Kenneth C. Davis. We have a lot to talk about: the history of leadership in America, the history of pandemics in America, and the fact that a president who is not considered a very good president actually helped save the world from starvation. A little something you didn't know about Herbert Hoover. We had a wonderful conversation. As always, here it is. Joining me now is my favorite historian. He is the author of the Don't Know Much series of history books, and I've got them all. I own them all. You should as well. Don'tKnowMuch.com. It's Kenneth C. Davis for a very important history lesson. Professor, as always, thank you so much for joining me. Great to have you.
Good evening, Pete. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me, and I hope you and yours are all well.
We're hanging in there. We have food in the pantry closet. We have 2 fridges with food in them, and I think for that reason we're pretty privileged. And that's what I wanted to talk with you about, because there's a major issue right now with hunger and food insecurity here, not only in America but around the world. And you can give us a bit of a history lesson and talk about, of all people, Herbert Hoover and what he did during World War I to help keep people from starving to death. Is that right?
I'm going to say that this man was responsible for the the lives of perhaps tens of millions of people. And it's part of the, hidden history, because when we think Herbert Hoover, we automatically think of the man who oversaw the disaster that became the Great Depression. Hoover is a pretty extraordinary American story, and if certainly that's where the story ends. In 1929, we get the crash. Hoover's the president. He keeps promising people that the recovery is right around the corner, that the markets are coming back, that capitalism will be returned, and we just have to get back to normal, and the banks will come back. And it just kept going on and on and on and on, and getting worse and worse, of course. And then this was the Great Depression, the beginning of the true worst years of the Great Depression. Of course, Hoover then lost to Franklin D. Roosevelt in the election of 1932, and then kind of got written out of history as a failed, doomed president. But it really kind of overlooks a very important part of Hoover's biography, which is that he saved millions of lives during World War I. Hoover was a very successful businessman. He'd been in the mining and engineering world. He made a fortune. He was actually a kid who was an orphan, orphaned as a child.
Really?
Self-made, yes, orphaned as a child, a Quaker from Iowa. His parents both died. He moved to be with, I think, an aunt and uncle. Eventually went to a very new Stanford University, and then flourished in the world of mining, and he was a very smart guy. Made a fortune, and really then started to turn towards a career more in philanthropy. Quaker roots being very much in mind to use his wealth to help people. During World War I, there were Americans in Europe, and Hoover, being in Europe at the time, actually organized a rescue of some of the Americans in Europe. Then he was also aware that because of the war, which started in August of 1914, there was a blockade, a quarantine of Germany. So food wasn't going into Germany. That meant food wasn't going into the places where the Germans had already occupied, like Belgium. Hoover actually organized a relief effort to feed the people of Belgium. And to do this, he had to get the combatant nations, Germany and Great Britain on one side and France on one side, to agree that he would bring food in. And he really kind of organizes this piratical state of helping people and carries it off. And then when the United States
What kind of a state? Piratical?
Yeah, that's how it was described, a state of piratical beneficence. It's quite extraordinary that this man was able to do this. And this is a guy, by the way, who would have said government shouldn't do any of these kind of things. He was a true hardcore, old-fashioned Republican, where the government should be small and people should do things for themselves. But he really did put together ships and supply lines. He set up a railway, a telegraph network. Apparently, he even set up his own passports and made treaties with governments. It was not a charity in a sense. And I said at the time, it was a British diplomat actually used the words "a piratical state organized for benevolence." What a great idea! But
Nobody talks that way anymore.
No one talks that way anymore.
Not this president. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway. Yeah.
But you have to realize he then, once the United States got into the war, which happens in 1917, and we've talked about World War I recently a little bit because of the overlap with the Spanish flu. And of course, the Spanish flu was going on at the same time all of this was going on. Once the United States is into the war effort, he was tasked to get more food into the mouths of starving people in a war zone. he organizes this massive program of locating food surpluses, transporting them to Europe as the trench wars are still being fought. And this became an American movement that once America was in the war, there were posters and propaganda. Food will win the war, and people started to organize meatless days and wheatless days and porkless days. This was all an attempt to economize on food in America to ship it to Europe where people were starving. And it was a success, a massive success. And Hoover was really credited with saving tens of millions of lives at the time. He then takes it another step, and this is even more extraordinary in some respects. The Russian Revolution was going on, and Russia was also in a dire state. He actually organized the same kind of relief effort for Russia under the Bolsheviks. And
yeah, when I read that in your piece at your website, I knew a little bit about what he did for Americans fighting in Europe, but I had no idea about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's quite an extraordinary story. He was told that the Russians were in a similar bad situation, and there was a famine going on, and this is in 1921, well after the war is over, and he actually makes a deal with the Bolsheviks, which is Lenin and Stalin, that he'll have a free hand to bring food in if they keep out of his way. And he got $20 million from the U.S. Congress and set up another relief administration to feed Russians under the Bolsheviks. It's really quite an extraordinary story. And because, unfortunately, then he became Commerce Secretary at a certain point during the next Republican administration and eventually becomes president. But he is president during the Great Crash and later the Great Depression. And it struck me when this story comes up, and I write about it on my blog at don'tknowmuch.com, because I'm reading these stories that we've seen in the newspaper of food lines around America. And they've been shocking. Shocking. To all of us.
I've been talking about them here, and most people probably aren't familiar with them and haven't had to wade in them. But they are. The word is the one that you chose. Absolutely shocking.
Shocking and staggering is the other word that Mother Jones used in discussing this the other day. We're talking about millions of Americans needing food. Now, this has been a kind of under the radar problem for a while. People, certainly people have been talking about it, but it certainly hasn't occupied our real chief concerns, that there are a lot of hungry people in this country. And that's one of the reasons why Mayor de Blasio didn't want to shut the school system down in New York, because so many children in New York City schools depend on New York City schools for their meals. So it wasn't just a simple shut the schools down to keep kids safe. It was really a matter of where are these children going to eat if we don't feed them? And that's a problem around the country. Food insecurity. It's an extraordinary idea that in the richest country in the world, where we have immense supplies, people are going hungry. But now this crisis and the fact that business has shut down and restaurants have shut down and people are out of work and grocery shelves are empty for a lot of people, have meant that tens of thousands of people are lining up at food banks. And we've seen pictures of cars, thousands of cars, miles-long lines of cars. And at the same time that I'm seeing that picture on the front page of the New York Times, I'm seeing a picture about farmers who are dumping milk, throwing away eggs, and plowing under vegetables because they are farmers that primarily service the world of the commercial restaurants and hotels and big institutions. And those supply lines, the food that goes into the grocery stores and the food that goes into commercial food manufacture and food processing are completely different. So you have this vision, it seems to me, of people needing food and farmers throwing away food. And, it just seems like this is a job for Herbert Hoover. That's the only thing I could think of when I saw this, is that this man would have said, wait a minute, there's a way we can get the food from those farmers who are dumping milk and smashing eggs and put them in the hands of people. So, it's really a matter of, is there a will to do it? And then do you have leadership that's willing to take that on? And in World War I, a Republican, a staunch Republican, took that on because he saw that there was this devastating need in Europe. It wasn't even Americans starving. It was Europeans starving. Now we have Americans who are starving, and we have a solution or potential solution to at least part of the problem. But nobody is certainly taking up that as a potential solution that I'm aware of.
In Wisconsin and Ohio, farmers are dumping thousands of gallons of fresh milk in the lagoons and manure pits. An Idaho farmer has dug huge ditches to bury 1 million pounds of onions. And in South Florida, a region that supplies much of the eastern half of the United States with produce, tractors are crisscrossing bean and cabbage fields, plowing perfectly ripe vegetables back into the soil. That's what you're referring to, that article in the New York Times by David Yaffe, Bellany, and Michael Corkery. And I think that's the article you're referring to. And you're also pointing out the problem with our system is not a problem of scarcity. It's a problem of distribution. It's an economic problem and a procurement problem, it would seem, a supply chain problem. But
this is the word is logistics, I think, that we're looking for. And
thank you.
We have people who are really good in logistics. They are really good at getting things like tanks and millions of pounds of food and airplanes all over the world. It's called the Department of Defense. So, it strikes me that with appropriate leadership and the will, this could be a problem that could be addressed. And as I write in my brief post about this today on my website, we have a society that's capable of I can go on my computer tonight and have T-shirts delivered here tomorrow morning from any one number of suppliers. I can get on my phone and have a car meet me on this corner. So we have the technical capability to do these things. It's really, again, a matter of will and leadership. And it certainly isn't a matter of cost. If we're really ready to put down many billions of dollars to save the airline industry, if this is truly a war and we're in a wartime style emergency, we can spend the money to make sure people are fed.
This is, I want to ask you that. This is almost exactly like a war. The situation that we are in right now and what a war would ask of its nation. It's very comparable. You have written about every major war in this country's history, and you wrote an amazing book about the Spanish flu, which is what we last spoke about the last time you were on the show.
Right, and more deadly than war.
I'm so glad you mentioned the title because I couldn't remember it, and it was embarrassing. I don't have it in front of me. More Deadly Than War. And a lot of people love that interview, as a matter of fact. And how would you, knowing what you know about war, and it's a lot, compare this situation as well as knowing what you know about the Spanish flu?
Well, the truth is, Pete, that while the United States has been in many wars, we've not had a lot of wars fought on our territory. One in particular, of course, stands out, the American Civil War. It was really the last time there were true pitched battles in the United States of America. And there are times in that war when cities were under siege and completely surrounded, and people didn't eat for a long, long time. The city of Vicksburg, for instance, in the South, and the city of Petersburg in Virginia. These were cities that were completely surrounded and under siege for months and sometimes a year, and people starved. So war does that. War forces people into quarantines sometime. So we are in a sort of war here, and we've been quarantined and penned in because of this enemy, which is the invisible enemy of a virus. But it is no different than if an army had invaded New York City and surrounded the city, and we couldn't get out, and we couldn't get anything in. So I think that the wartime simile is equivalent. I think it works. I think that we have to. I think there was even a certain person who claimed to be a wartime president early on in this fiasco of presidential leadership that we've had. So we are in a wartime type emergency, even if nobody's firing bombs and bullets at us. So I think that it requires the kind of wartime response that we saw in this country in World War I and certainly in World War II. I mean, a lot of people aren't aware of this. There was rationing. You know, people would think if we had rationing today, they'd go crazy at the idea.
What kind of rationing were there? There was also...
There is toilet paper rationing of a sort. You can only buy one roll at a time in most places in New York City. But no, I'm serious. This is the government established rationing rules in both World War I and World War II.
Weren't there also not only rationing of items, weren't there freezes on salaries for high-paid executives during the war effort?
Yeah, many of those things were put into effect, and again, when you are at war against Hitler and Japan, and that is the all-consuming issue for the people of the country, those sort of emergency measures are easier to take, I suppose, or they go down more easily. And I don't think that in the current atmosphere anyone would be able to get such a thing through Congress.
How do you measure?
Would be required.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. It would be difficult to get anything, through Congress that would be effective policy. That's one of the most important challenges here. Even if we knew the right way forward, the politics are fraught with division, which is why I wanted to ask you, you're the historian. During World War II and during many other times, challenging times in our country's history, people recognized the problem and were in unity, at least with recognition of the problem, probably divided in many ways over what the way forward, what the solutions were. But, I mean, there was a lot of unity in World War II in terms of the war effort. Everybody did their role, played their part, and you could argue there were similar reactions at other times. It would seem, Professor, that this time, right now, the current time that we are in this country, we are divided over the problem. There were people in the streets of Michigan protesting that they wanted to get back to work. People don't recognize the issue, much less agree on the solution. I feel like our division is our main problem. What does the history tell us? Well,
you're absolutely right in the sense that in 1941 we had Pearl Harbor and the nation was brought together, just as in much more recent memory we had 9/11, and there wasn't a remarkable degree of unity in the country for a considerable amount of time after 9/11. And during World War II it was for the duration. There were certainly the small minority of people who either opposed the war or were looking for other ways or didn't like Roosevelt's approach. But there was really not a great deal of pushback in terms of preventing the war effort from going on. And certainly there were people who profited from it as well. And that's always part of what war is about. But people, not only the average
people contributed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You were expected to do your part in both World War I and World War II. And I think the fact that it was a visible war, a very visible war with men in uniform and suns going off and people hanging their gold stars in the window because the suns weren't coming home, it was a very different atmosphere. Completely. And the whole nation was on a war footing that all of the factories were really transformed into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. So
Right.
that General Motors did stop making cars and started making tanks. Now they've apparently made the shift to making ventilators. So it can be done.
It can be done, but the America of 1941 put women on the assembly line, and the America of 2020 is just asking us to stay home and stay on the couch. I mean, it's not. It's not a big
enormous.
ask.
Yes, it's an enormous difference in the psychology of what we were asked in World War I and World War II. Everyone was asked to do their part, and then to do your part was to, have a victory garden. Women didn't wear stockings because they needed the silk for parachutes. So, on and on and on. People were asked to make sacrifices that were material, and they could give things, and they could volunteer and join the different services and support groups for servicemen. Now we're asked to do our part by doing nothing, and it's a very, very different psychology, and it's a very difficult psychology. I'm here in Manhattan, and I have to tell you, New Yorkers that I see are really getting it done. So there's this remarkable thing that happens every night at 7:00 where we all open up our windows and whistle and bang pots and cheer and scream. It's become this nightly ritual, and you don't
have to live near a hospital.
No, you don't have to. We don't have a hospital near us.
But people
near
still
us
do
at
it.
all. Yeah, absolutely, and it seems to be getting louder each night.
What if you want to take a nap at that time? There's got to be some miserable New Yorkers going, here we go again with all this noise. I love it. That's great. But I mean, history is filled with great leaders that ask a country, not just talking about America, you could even talk about private organization, that ask people to do something for that country, for that effort, for that cause. And people do it. They listen to that leader. Donald Trump isn't asking anybody to do anything. He's not asking for a sacrifice. And even if he did, he wouldn't be able to accomplish it. We're in desperate need of leadership. What does the history tell us about how important that leadership is at times in crises like these?
Well, look, the two greatest crises in American history, the American Civil War and then the Great Depression combined with World War II, produced two of the greatest leaders in American history, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt. They certainly, to some degree, greatness is thrust upon them, but they were certainly men who rose to the occasion, and that doesn't always happen. There have been, other moments in history when leaders didn't rise to the. Certainly, the men who preceded Lincoln in office were facing crises, but they didn't rise to the occasion. They worsened the things, and that's why, for the most part, Lincoln's predecessors are pretty much go down in history as failures, including his immediate predecessor, James Buchanan. It's sometimes the moment makes the man, but you still have to be the person to begin with. We are not in a situation where we have a person who inspires people to want to, give something bigger than something of themselves. I'm of the generation where we had a president, the first president in my consciousness, got up there and said, "Ask not what what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." We're not hearing that right now, are we?
No, it's more like, have you seen the ratings for this press conference? They're higher.
Well, I didn't really want to go down this road with you, my friend. But
I know
the fact is, I think that Americans would really rally to that kind of call right now.
Sure.
And I think, in a way, you saw a taste of it from Barack Obama's endorsement of Joe Biden, where he spoke to people in the way that he could speak to people. Now, that's a great skill. It's a great attribute. It's part of what made him so beloved as a president to so many people, obviously not to everyone, but I think if you saw that clip of his full clip of his endorsement of Joe Biden, you saw a man who has a sense of the feeling for the moment, empathy with the people, and is willing to call on people to be something bigger, to do something bigger than what they need or want for themselves. And that's not something that we've been asked in this country for a long time, to be frank. We haven't asked citizens to do their part.
No, the war in Iraq, the president at the time told us to go shop. The war in Iraq did ask of no sacrifice for Americans other than the less than 1% of military families.
And this has been, largely true in this country since Vietnam, and shifting from a draft army, a conscript army, to an all-volunteer army. The military is a separate facet of American society today. So we don't have that sense of shared commitment that my father was of the World War II generation, and after Pearl Harbor, he went off to war, and so did my wife's father. So we are the children of that generation, and that was really the last generation that so willingly did that. In neither Korea nor Vietnam was that the case, because so we haven't had that sense in this country of somebody really saying let's pull together and get out of this mess together. And so I think that part of it is we've lived through an era that I described in Don't Know Much About History, one of my books, as an era of broken trust, that Americans feel like something really broke in the system, and not 3 years ago and not 10 years ago, going back a ways. And I think that because of that sense of broken trust, and it goes back to the Enron and the failures of the CIA and the FBI, and the whole realm of social and governmental failures.
Yeah, 9/11 and the recession of 2008.
That lead up to those moments really have, I think, broken Americans' faith that the government can do the right thing. And so it's going to be difficult for governments, I think, to call on people, but I think that the will is still there. I feel that it is there in terms of the people I speak to and what I hear people say. I think there are a lot of people right now who wish they could do more. I mean, you're not even really told to go give blood, because even though they need blood, it's really don't go to the hospital. So
you don't want to go to the gas station, much less the blood center. Yeah.
So it's a strange moment in which many people want to have a feeling of doing something, and they're not able to. I remember in 9/11, right after 9/11, being here in the West Village where I live in Manhattan, a lot of people wanted to go out and do something. They either went over to St. Vincent's Hospital, which was still open at that time, or up to the Javits Center, and they couldn't do anything because there was no need for volunteers. They needed people who could go down to the Trade Center site and clean it up, but that was obviously a very specialized task, and those people many of them have paid a heavy price for that. Yeah. But I think that there was this terrible sense of, we want to do something, we want to give something, and there was no opportunity to do that. And so that was it wasn't like Pearl Harbor, where a lot of guys just went out and signed up the next day.
Although a lot of people did after 9/11.
Yes, a lot of people did, but in World War II, in 1941, I mean, a lot of people did it. Millions.
Yeah, much different. I really appreciate you joining me on short notice. I so love talking to you and learning from you, and I have all of your books here on my bookcase, and everybody listening should too. You really should. Follow him on Twitter, by the way, at Kenneth C. Davis. But go right now. Go ahead. Open your phone. Get on your computer. don'tknowmuch.com. I promise you, you will love all of his work, and you will thank me for referring you to it. Always a pleasure, my friend. I really appreciate it. I always learn so much.
Thank you, Pete. It's a pleasure to talk to you as well. And I hope everybody's staying safe, staying home, and taking care.
Yeah, yours too. Keep in touch, pal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pete.
There you go, Kenneth C. Davis. Follow him on Twitter. Buy all of his books. Same for Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And thank you to my partner in this life, Valerie, for everything that she does to support me each and every day and for joining me in discussion on today's show. And mostly to you, to all of the new subscribers on Patreon. Thank you, thank you, thank you. They just keep coming in, and it gives me such purpose and such inspiration and makes me feel valued, and I'm working so hard to bring the best guests and thoughtful conversation, as well as bring you into the conversation and keep connecting with you. I've talked to so many of you off the air. Every day I call listeners, and that is becoming a huge part of the show, the community that we're creating and connecting as we struggle through this time, and now doing it daily. Everything, figuring it out together with you. That's all I got. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I love you. And you're not alone. You're never alone.